So you don't need a $5,000 camera to shoot a great video. You just need to know a few basic tips to elevate your film. Let's get into it. Want to create a video that looks cinematic, smooth, and actually watchable, even if you're just getting started? In this video, I'm breaking down the basics of videography in a way that's super simple to understand. If you've ever felt confused by frame rates, shutter speeds, ISO, or how to get smooth video on your phone or camera, don't worry. We're going to make it make sense. And the great thing is you don't even need to have a high-end camera to follow along. All you need is a camera that actually allows you to shoot manually. A camera that allows you to adjust the individual parameters within the settings. So let's get into it. So first things first, let's talk frame rate. Think about things this way. The way video works is that your camera takes numerous pictures per second. Each individual picture is a frame. Those pictures then come together to create movement within the video. So 24 frames per second means 24 pictures within a second. Frame rate is how many individual frames or pictures your camera captures per second. So 24 frames per second is the industry standard for films because it gives natural, slightly motion blurred cinematic look. So 30 frames per second is common for TV and online content. It's slightly smoother and more real-time looking. It's hard for most people to tell the difference between 24 frames or 30 frames, but as you begin to work with more and more cameras, the more you'll start to see the nuances between the two. Now, 60 frames per second is ultra smooth footage. It's often used for sports or action. At this frame rate, motion blur tends to completely disappear and the footage looks somewhat unnatural to the eye. But those higher frame rates, we're talking 60 frames per second, 120 frames per second, and even 240 frames per second, is absolutely great for slow motion because it gives you more frames to work with when you slow it down in post. And that's how you get the slow motion footage. But there are some things you need to keep in mind when you're working with certain frame rates. Number one, the higher the frame rate, the more data you're capturing. So your file sizes will increase. So you will be filling up cards quickly. And number two, pick a frame rate and stick with it. Try not to mix 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, and then throwing 60 frames per second into the mix. Your viewers will absolutely see the difference and your video will lack cohesion. Choose based on the look you want and how much motion is in your scene. Next up, shutter speed. Shutter speed is how long your camera sensor is exposed to light for each frame. It's measured in fractions of a second. So think 1/60th, 1/100th, etc. You get the idea. Now, when you're talking about shutter speed, it's absolutely important to keep in mind the 180-degree shutter rule. Now, in filmmaking, the 180-degree shutter rule dictates that the shutter speed should be set to double the frame rate to achieve a natural looking amount of motion blur. So that means you have to set your shutter speed to double your frame rate to get natural looking motion blur. So you have to do some math here, right? For 24 frames per second, that means you're using 1/50th of a shutter speed. For 30 frames per second, 1/60th. For 60 frames per second, you're using 1/20th. And if you were able to crank up the frames per second to, let's say, something crazy like 1,000 frames per second, that means you're going to use a shutter speed of 1/2000th of a second. Now, let's say we have a frame rate of 24 frames per second and you decide to use a really fast shutter speed, like let's say 1/1000th of a second. The movement will look choppy or stuttery to your viewers. There may be some artistic reasons to do something like this, but it doesn't always look too natural. Or vice versa, if you have too slow of a shutter speed, let's say like 1/8th of a second, the motion in the video will become too blurry or ghost-like. But once again, this can be used for an artistic flair. You just need to figure out how well it fits within your story that you're trying to tell in your film. Now, shutter speed, ISO, and aperture all affect the brightness of an image, but we're going to dive into that a little later in the video, and I'll show you how it relates all to frame rate, along with some major tips to remember. When you're learning about videography or photography, you'll hear two terms thrown around a lot when talking about aperture: f-stops and t-stops. While they both relate to how much light is entering your lens, there's a big difference between the two, especially if you're shooting video. Now, let's start with the f-stop. The f-stop, or f number, is a mathematical ratio. It tells you how big the opening of your lens is compared to the focal length. For example, an aperture of f2.8 means the diameter of the opening of the focal length is divided by 2.8. To be honest, this mathematical equation absolutely means nothing to you. However, this number helps you control exposure and depth of field, and the amount of blur or sharpness in the background. But here's the catch. F-stops are theoretical. They describe the size of the aperture, but don't account for how much light is lost as it passes through the lens elements, like the glass or the coatings inside. Now, this is where T-stops come in. A T-stop, or a transmission stop, is a more accurate measurement. It tells you the actual amount of light hitting your camera sensor. It factors in light loss inside the lens. So if a lens says it's f2.8, but only lets in the amount of light you'd expect from, let's say, f3.2, its T-stop might be 3.2. Now, this matters a lot in filmmaking. When you're matching footage from two different lenses, say, one on a wide shot and one on a close-up shot, you want the exposure to match exactly. Using a T-stop ensures that, because it's based on actual light transmission, not just the size of the opening. So, to sum it all up, f-stop, the size of the lens opening; t-stop, how much light is actually transmitted to the sensor, your real exposure. Photographers use f-stops because slight variations don't usually affect a still image. But videographers and cinematographers prefer T-stops for consistency between shots, especially on set where exposure continuously is critical. If you're shooting video and want the most accurate exposure control, especially across multiple lenses, look for cinema cameras with T-stop markings. But here's the overall issue with cinema lenses. The majority of them tend to be manual lenses, so that's something you should definitely keep in mind. All right, next up. When we talk about ISO in photography or videography, we're really talking about how sensitive your camera sensor is to light. A low ISO number like 100 or 200 means your sensor is less sensitive, so it needs more light to create a properly exposed image. But the trade-off is you get cleaner, sharper images with less noise or grain. A high ISO number like 1600, 3200, or beyond boosts the sensor sensitivity. Now, that's helpful in dark environments, but it comes at a cost. More noise, less dynamic range, and potentially some color distortion. Now, this is where it gets really important, especially if you're aiming for professional quality images or video. Every camera has something called a base ISO. Now, a base ISO is the native sensitivity of your camera's sensor. It's the ISO setting where your camera performs its absolute best. That means maximum sharpness, best dynamic range, most accurate color, and the lowest amount of noise. For most cameras, the base ISO is usually probably around 100 on most mirrorless and DSLR cameras. But on more cinema cameras, things get a little bit more advanced. Some have dual-based ISO like 800 and 3200, giving you a sweet spot depending on your lighting conditions. I know the Canon R5 has a base ISO of 800. So when you're shooting in good light, it's best to stay close to your base ISO as much as possible. If you crank it up higher, you're digitally amplifying the signal, which amplifies the noise. Here's a real-world example. If you're shooting an interview and you want the cleanest, most professional look, you set the base ISO to, let's say, 800. And then you adjust your lighting, your aperture, or your shutter speed to maintain that exposure. If you're filming in a dark event space or during nighttime, you might have to raise your ISO, but you'll be doing so knowing that it comes with some trade-offs like increased noise. So remember, ISO controls sensitivity to light. A higher ISO means more sensitivity, but more noise. Your base ISO means that you're going to get your cleanest, highest quality image. So don't forget, stick to your base ISO when possible and raise it only when necessary. Understanding ISO and base ISO helps you not just expose an image, but to do it in a way that protects your image quality. And I just want you to remember one thing. When it comes to ISO, when it comes to frame rates and shutter speed, when it comes to the aperture, you're always going back to this concept of the exposure triangle. It's how we expose our images. So as long as you keep that in mind, you'll be good. Now you understand the basics of how to expose an image. Let me give you 3 tips that I think every beginner should follow. Tip number 1, don't just expose the scene, expose the emotion. Instead of asking, is this bright enough? Ask, how should this feel? Use light and shadow intentionally. Underexposing a moody scene can create tension or intimacy. Overexposing can create a light, open, or joyful feeling. You're painting with light, so think emotionally, not just technically. Remember, there's a reason for absolutely everything in cinematography. Be intentional. Number 2, control depth with aperture to focus emotion. A wide aperture like f1.8 gives you that creamy blurred background and pulls all the attention to your subject. It's great for emotional moments like interviews or a specific part in your movie. A narrow aperture like f8 keeps more in focus and is perfect for landscapes or scenes where the whole world matters. Depth of field is a storytelling tool. Use it to guide your viewer's eye. And just like with every tool, there's a right place and a time for it. Mix it up and keep the attention of your viewer. Tip number 3, use shutter speed to set the energy of your film. You want natural, smooth motion? You're gonna stick to the 180-degree rule. Double your frame rate. But you wanna shake things up? Use a faster shutter speed for intense, jittery energy like in action scenes. Or you could slow it down for surreal, dreamy blur. Motion isn't just physics, it's feeling. Once again, we get back to that same concept. It's all about feeling and storytelling. And just like that, we're done. I hope you learned something in this video, and if you did, please leave a thumbs up for this video. And also click over here for some videos that YouTube thinks that you'll enjoy. Anyway, as always, take care of yourself, and until next time, peace.